is also really clear to me that you can't understand contemporary activism along exactly the same dimensions. That, what counts as activism has really, in some ways, changed quite a bit since Seattle. And so current protests are not just a continuation of events at the turn of millennium. And they, in many ways, they represent a more, or rather a new generation of post-Seattle protests that embody a kind of collective action that is fueled by, in some ways, more intensive but yet more diverse kinds of social networking, more diffuse yet more focused issue engagement, and more provisional while still durable goal setting. So this is a very specific form of contentious politics. And I guess my goal broadly is to try and highlight that specificity. And I want to highlight that kind of specificity in this particular mode of contention, which we call activism or the new activism, by using the term a new dialogic. And how I understand this new dialogic is in terms of a technologically enabled emphasis on connectivity, horizontal coordination, and consensus. And that drives activist organizing. So it's connectivity, horizontal coordination, and consensus. So was activist organizing always this way? How did we get there? What are its implications? How much of contemporary activism and contentious politics, at least in the West, does it actually explain? So what I'm going to try and do is address these issues and qualify it by means of a couple of, with some field work that I've done in Aotearoa, New Zealand over the last 6 years with collaborators such as Cynthia Stoll and Heather Zoller. So really, this presentation, I think, unlike the first one, which is much more focused, I think this merges like 3 or 4 different projects. So I might be a bit all over the place. So in case I am, just tell me. So let me start by talking about the new dialogic, which is the term that I want us, I think, to focus on quite a bit right now. So the backdrop of the new dialogic is informational capitalism, okay, and the rise of the network society, which in many ways, like when I use the term network society, I refer to Manuel Castell's trilogy, which came out in 1996. And really, that trilogy is what we can call sort of Manuel Castell's attempting to be Max Weber. That was his Max Weber moment. That was when he wanted to really sort of produce this gigantic tome that really sort of explained economic and political and cultural arrangements in contemporary society. So he defines network society right there in his 2004 book, calling it the social structure that results from the interaction between social organization, social change, and a technological paradigm. Okay, so these 3 elements, I think, are actually kind of important. So because he frames the emergence of the network society as, it's kind of interesting because he keeps calling it an accidental coincidence, but really there's a deeper telos in his work, a deeper modern telos, but I'm not going to deconstruct that right now. But he says that in the 70s there was the accidental coincidence of what he says are 3 independent processes, okay? So, and their interaction, the interaction of these 3 processes created this new technological paradigm, which he calls informationalism. So he calls it, well, these 3 factors are, he calls the crisis and consequent restructuring of industrial capitalism, especially in countries such as Britain and the United States, and the sort of like the decline of Keynesian economic models, right? So this crisis and its 2 associate modes of production, which are capitalism and statism, and a new focus espoused by such people as Reagan and Thatcher on informational-based or informational capitalism, right? So that's a historical moment that he associates with the late 70s. And the second force that he says is independent that happened around the same time was, he calls these the freedom-oriented cultural social movements of the late 60s and early 70s that emphasized personal autonomy. Okay? And the third set of forces is the revolution in information and communication technologies with miniaturization, and which also sort of began in the 50s and 60s. So he said all of these culminated to create informationalism and the social structure of informationalism, the network society. Okay, so when I look at this and I say, well, this desire for connection, right? I mean, the whole idea that information wants to be free, the whole idea that information spreads is, I think, a fundamental characteristic of this network society. And in many ways, that's what I'm referring to as the new dialogic. Okay? The logic of network society is a dialogic. All right? So hence the semantic play on that word. And there are many aspects of networking logic, and the new dialogic can be found in the work of many scholars, not just Castells. So, and several have looked at networking and networking logics as they are embedded in contemporary activism. And the person whose work I think of the most here is Jeffrey Juris, who's done a lot of work. I mean, his 2008 book on the networking logic of activism, I think, is a case in point. And for Juris, this networking logic, okay, or the cultural logic of networking is what he calls, as he calls it, is characterized by what I interpret Juris as saying is that it is a threefold model. That's a gigantic quote. I mean, if you want to look at it later on, then I can give you these slides. But essentially, this network, the cultural logic of networking, emphasizes coordination, consensus, and exchange. Those are the three aspects of this very specific notion of networking that Juris, based on Castell's work, propounds. Okay, and I want us to sort of pay attention to these three aspects, the coordination, consensus, and exchange, because I think they're pretty important. And in many ways, I mean, this CCE model, coordination, consensus, exchange model, is very similar to what the political communication scholar Lance Bennett has called digitally networked action, or DNA, or connective action. There are any number of phrases for it. So I think that this dialogic has had three consequences. Okay? The first is that this focus on exchange, the technological connectivity, has allowed activism to shift from the realm of formal large organizations to the polity at large. That is, to short-lived, small, informal, transient activist groups. Right, so that has been one major shift, and this has happened because of reduced transaction costs. Right, as in a previous generation of activism, you always needed a gigantic organization because raising awareness was so difficult. It was difficult to produce pamphlets. It's difficult to mobilize opinion. But those transaction costs are much reduced now. Right, and so hence this shift. I'm not saying that I buy the shift, but I am saying that this is sort of in many ways sort of a consequence of this new dialogic. The second consequence is what one might call the development of thin ties. And again, over here I'm drawing from the work of Lance Bennett. A thin tie is the idea that technology enables loose and flexible connections between people and issues. So a thin tie between you and an issue is the fact that you might like something on Facebook. That requires very little ideological commitment on your part. It's a very thin, flimsy connection between you and a social issue. So this in turn allows flexibility. This in turn allows flexibility, decentralization, and a loose association with causes. And the ultimate consequence is what one might call connective action, okay, or that which is organizationless action. Recall that collective action requires organizations, right? Collective action cannot occur without any kind of organizational infrastructure. But in an environment where the infrastructure is already provided, then the action becomes connective rather than collective. Okay, so. A third consequence, so the first consequence is, informal organizing. Second consequence is thin ties and connective action. The third consequence is the complexity of framing. So there are two really interesting things here. Okay, so maybe I should begin with the second one first. And some people, several scholars, and I kind of buy this argument, say that contemporary global social movements are successful because their global frames are so broad and ambiguous as to render them personalizable to diverse individuals. Okay, I'm not, the part about this that I find compelling is the idea that broad and ambiguous frames tend to travel